university, so people wander in, so we always start a few minutes. If you ever want to know the time, give Mr. Joel, is to see him there in the fall? Where? Just in the other room.
Oh. Good put my glasses, but I'm going to speak without my glasses. I can read my notes. Yeah, that's probably better because I want to see that stuff.
So, what are you looking at, about 30 or 40 minutes?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I got 9 pages of time.
Okay, perfect. Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jim Turk. I'm the director of the Center for Free Expression. I'd like to welcome all of you today to today's talk by Ken Rubin on battling secrecy. But before I introduce Ken, and as people are coming in, I just want to say that one of the other, the center has about a dozen public events of this sort each year. If you're interested in being on our email list to receive notices of future events, Ange Holmes, who's the coordinator for the center, is going to be passing around just a list, and if you want to put your name and email address on, we'll add you to the list. One of the other events that we're sponsoring this year for the first time, is a film series. We're having once every month in conjunction with the School of Image Arts, we're having a film and discussion, a film dealing with issues of repression, dissent, and free expression. The last film we showed this month was George Clooney's Good Night and Good Luck, about the McCarthy period in the United States, a wonderful film. The next film that we're showing is going to be on December 5th, and it's a film, it's a film that was shot in Iran by a really top-notch Iranian filmmaker entitled This Is Not a Film, which is an ironic title for a film, but he was under house arrest and so it's a very interesting award-winning film about the situation in Iran currently. And then for our spring series, I'm going to just pass around, I'll hand these out and you can help yourselves to one, and they're all on our website if you want to check, of the 5 films that we're going to have in the spring. And they're all free, and they're in a lovely theater in the School of Image Arts, so I'd encourage you to come if you're interested. It's a real pleasure for me personally to be introducing our speaker today. For many of us, one of the real problems that underlies so much of the work we want to do is how zealously the Government of Canada and provincial governments and municipal governments and government agencies and hospitals and health authorities keep secrets. And normally that wouldn't be a problem, except those secrets are things that we have a right to know, and theoretically under our laws we have an ability to know, but in practice we're denied, with very negative, often negative consequences for our ability to be safe, to have the kind of society we want, to protect our children, to protect ourselves. And so we try to use access to information legislation which exists at the federal, provincial, municipal levels, saying we have a right to this, and then we discover that really goes against the theory of how governments operate, and the law is such that it's hardly a robust protection of public interest. There's an international organization that evaluates the adequacy and effectiveness of legislation protecting access to information, I think in 80 countries, and 120 countries now, and Canada was, what, 59th, I believe, in the list, behind every other English-speaking country, behind Guatemala and others. And that's just what the law says. When you look at how the practice unfolds under the law, a lot of the problems are even worse. So when we go looking, there are some people who are as good as it gets in Canada at finding things. And in my limited and humble estimation, the person I think is the best at it in the whole country is our speaker today, and that's Ken Rubin.
Well,
Now, Ken's a humble guy and is well aware of how many hundreds of hours he has to spend getting one piece of information. Nancy Oliveri, who's with us, Ken's been searching for information about some vital health records from the University Health Net for how many years for you? 3?
Just 3.
Just 3? Seems like longer. It is a real challenge. And so Ken's here to talk with us both about the issue of access to information, some of the challenges in getting it, and some of the ways we might move forward in dealing with it. So it's with great pleasure that I turn this over to Ken Rubin.
Thank you, Jim. I first came to Toronto over 5 decades ago on my way to a student conference in Montreal. I'm from Winnipeg. And I got off at Union Station by train and went with a guy whose uncle was the chief cheese at Cara. Now there's Swiss Chalet and so on. I went for a 4-course dinner, very impressive. And then I decided to go down Yonge Street, ended up in Yorkville, of course, before the pre-HIP days, and poked my head in various places, including a communist reading room. So my half-day overlay in Toronto was quite interesting, and it evoked my curiosity and my senses. And but it took time to mature and to start having my research and my freedom of information work make the headlines regularly with help from some of Canada's best journalists. My talk today highlights what it takes to become and remain an advocate ready to do battle against all forms of entrenched secrecy. I will explore some of my war stories and save time for discussion. That Canada is secretive is where I'll begin. We have an elite top-down system where decisions are made behind closed doors and with little input, public input or knowledge, instead of living in an internet age of free expression and easy and quick access to information. We are fed propaganda, spin, and delayed responses that are missing key data. Can you imagine City Hall meetings being held in total secrecy, where the verbatim discussions are never recorded, and where the sanitized summaries kept or not released for 20 years? Well, welcome to Canada, the land of outlandish transparency lies, faceless bureaucrats, corporate Mongos, and more concealment of information. The few in control are allowed legally to destroy all kinds of draft information that affect us and circumvent access via private emails, use of lawyers, and communications, oral communications, and more. The myth of the last 35 years has been that citizens get a lot of information. But the truth is the exemptions and exclusions control the way public information requests are handled. Amendments in the current Bill C-58 before Parliament do not change that and add tight restrictions. The list of formal and informal secrecy practices is very long. Let me give you some of them. Excessive use of exemptions. I could go on for half an hour on each of these. Agencies and ministers excluded from public access. Privacy concerns taking precedence over public release. Third-party privilege where corporations can be notified and object to public release. Time delays, fee barriers, word games, and nitpicking. National security, classification, and overrides. Statutory confidentiality prohibitions and other legislation. Central agency control of an old boys network operating in a culture of secrecy. Preemptive leaks of information, damage control, spinning, and just plain lying, deceit and deception, oral not recorded decisions, electronic erasing, record alterations, hidden records, early ministerial warning practices designed to delay access, multi-endless consultations, user profiling targeting troublesome, vexatious requesters, and amber lighting those seeking hot topic information. They're singled out for tougher treatment. So all of these and more work out to a nice system of creative avoidance. I'm feeling comfortable already if I'm in Ottawa and I'm a bureaucrat. Now, what's the problem with this is that it's difficult to get important data. And that data is on waste and corruption, health and safety matters, political pork barreling and spin, personal embarrassments, we all know about that, consumer environmental degradation, security and civil liberties abuses, injustices and inequalities. These are kind of important topics. So my public interest research experience began with and continues through citizen, consumer, environmental, and journalist investigative work. With citizens groups, I learned the art of information queries and activism. And I and others took on Bell Canada and rate hearings, battled car manufacturers and governments for their failure to divulge secret car warranties, and tackled the food industry's unhealthy foods. I became a lifelong advocate for transparency, lobbying for freedom of information and privacy protection legislation, and producing reports that examined excessive secrecy practices and unnecessary excluded cabinet confidences. I filed thousands of requests, either on my initiative or on behalf of a variety of client groups and individuals struggling to obtain data. It's meant going to courts where necessary, appearing as a parliamentary witness, writing about many deficiencies of access legislation, and having hundreds of media stories done on documents uncovered. Tom Spears, who's an Ottawa Citizen reporter, captured what I do. He said, to get at Ken Rubin does, he said, you have to know the story of Mila Mulrooney's furniture. In 1993, the Secretive NCC, National Capital Commission, decided to pay the Mulrooney's for the furniture they left behind at 24 Sussex Drive and issued them a check for $150,000. There was a public outcry, and so the NCC had to return the money. And things settled down. But Ken Rubin didn't feel the story was finished. He fished around the way he loves to and ultimately came up with an appraisal for the Mulrooney cast house from a reputable auction house. They were worth $39,050. Ouch. That is what Ken does. He pokes around and looks into locked filing cabinets, prying them open with various access to information laws, mostly at the federal level. He feels that people should have the right to know what their governments are doing, which is a radical idea in a town like Ottawa. And Tom concluded, Ottawa would be a duller place without Ken. So let me now illustrate my experience in digging up data in areas like health and safety, scandals, everybody likes a scandal, Indigenous files, corporate government hidden ties, assisting whistleblowers by using FOI for them, and even that show the lighter side of government. So let's start with health and safety. And it's been over 25 years with an investigative efforts at getting access to records, exposing Canada's role in asbestos promotion and export. Governments have been claiming to act in a responsible way when they said that all you have to do is have the safe use of asbestos and everything's fine, even though it's a known carcinogenic and health hazard. And so it was pushed, even if Canada outlawed a lot of the materials on countries overseas. And we sponsored, along with the Quebec government, by we I mean the Canadian government, spent over 60 million buckaroos, the Asbestos Institution, Crystallite Institution, the lobby group internationally for the safe use of asbestos. Our embassies and everybody would cooperate and hold these seminars and convince India or whoever it was that they should build their, for instance, houses out of concrete made with asbestos. But the problem is, even here in Canada, in car brakes or pad installations, and it's found in our schools, playgrounds, and buildings, there's still asbestos, and it's not all identified, and we haven't done enough about it. Meanwhile, though, former asbestos workers are still suffering serious health problems and dying prematurely and painful deaths. Another health and safety case revealed that as late as the 1980s, government researchers were helping the cigarette industry deliver tobacco strains with more nicotine. The federal government documents show that they maintained ties with the industry's tobacco research foundation. They rented public agricultural lands for their research. And, Ottawa still facilitates the tobacco exporters overseas on trade missions. Now, also long-standing has been my probes exposing food marketplace problems. Along the way, I went to court to get the big meat packer plant inspection reports released to the public. Court-ordered records showed that some plants had unacceptable ratings, with inspectors finding unsanitary and dangerous conditions. So what did the meat industry do? They decided by changing the rating system, A, whatever, and then the forms that the inspectors used took off the critical inspectors' comment part, and then in the end, the government just, along with their pressure, abolished ever doing meat inspection reports where we find ourselves today and have been paying for it, listeria and other things. So another investigation with the Canadian Food Inspection Agency showed CFI strongly lobbying the United States Agriculture Department not to do its daily inspections for more rigorous testing to discover listeria. Instead, they argued the U.S. to adopt the more lenient Canadian way of doing things. Another investigation resulted in exposing the food industry successfully lobbying for the prominence of their products in that Bible of Bibles, Canada's Food Guide. Do not trust the Canada Food Guide. And that I've found out through several forays over the years, and they're currently redeveloping it. A further probe exposed Monsanto's efforts to doctor its genetically modified food crop trials and its too close relationship with regulators. Monsanto, other records show, got government funds to get a foothold in the Chinese market via pilot projects planting their genetically engineered corn and cotton. Despite delays, earlier this year, I received data on AquaBounty's successful pressuring the government for export certificates to permit their genetically engineered salmon eggs commercial development abroad. This was done even before official market and safety approval was given. Now, today, unlabeled GE salmon fillets are coming into Canada for sale. You and I will never know because there's no right to know, no labeling. Let's turn to that sexy area of government waste and corruption. I helped ferret out what became known as the gross misuse of public funds under the sponsorship program. The year-by-year, region-by-region lists of who got the $250 million plus and commissions and extra for things like production costs. And it was critical for probing the sponsorship funding, but do you think the media people were interested? Not until I went to several media outlets, we won't name names, but when the Auditor General came out with her report, Sheila Fraser, and raised the alarm, then they started listening. And so stories got printed, myself and other journalists, exposing this massive fraud. For instance, I got all the sponsorship ones in Jean Chrétien's writings, the RCMP's 125th anniversary sponsorship project, which included a balloon, hot balloon, and big money going to the Indy car races in Toronto and Vancouver, where much of the money went to the liberal-friendly advertising agents, who in turn gave some of it back to the Liberal Party. Another example of wasteful billions uncovered involved Ottawa giving out loans under the loosely run Technology Partnership Program, TPC, for corporate research innovations. Independent audits that I accessed revealed questionable claims made by some companies for job creation royalties and the use of funds received. Much of the money has never been paid back. Some of the money went to unregistered lobbyists, charging large contingency fees for success fees. Getting at the program's specific loan approval status and repayments was always stalled and much was denied. This is what happens when you do access. One of my favorite examples in this area was when I dug up the Canadian politicians and senior officials took to staying in luxurious residence, one at the rate of nearly $3,500 a night during the 2002 Salt Lake City Winter Olympics. They even wore the fancy Roots shirts and everything that the athletes were wearing. They had a grand time at taxpayer expense. Now, an area dear to my heart that I'm turning to is I've done a lot of work to help people who are under duress or whistleblowers using freedom of information with their consent. Here's some examples. First of all, let me set the stage. Canada lacks strong whistleblowing protection laws that give the public or private sector workers free speech rights, adequate recourse to the courts, sufficient remedies against retaliation, and a level playing field where employees have to prove they acted to ensure employees were not harassed for trying to speak out after trying to do so internally. Canada also lacks sufficient safeguards for not placing Canadians in a danger at the mercy of countries with poor human rights records. One effort involved helping a Health Canada scientist, Dr. Pierre Blas, who was fired after several years of reviewing and questioning in memos the harmful effects of the breast implant medical device that Health Canada permitted on the market. You know, some of it was like what they put in mattresses. Blais believed there should be a voluntary halt of the device sale on the market. Cases were cropping up where it's caused women's health problems and trauma, leading, in some cases, the implant's removal. He had not been the source of leaks about this problem, was told not to accept an invitation to testify in a court hearing on the device's harmful effects. The government ordered him not to communicate his findings and blocked his appearance. Pierre was told to destroy his crucial report on the faults of the MEM breast implant by his superior not to talk to outsiders. After he was fired, I obtained, among other things, a memo from his superior confirming that he'd been asked to destroy his draft report on the unsafe use of this medical product. His case received publicity, but Pierre did not get his job back. That access work led to getting files for some of the women who had suffered because of their MEM and breast implants that had to be removed. One, Linda Wilson, was brave enough to want to talk about experience and appeared on CBC Marketplace. Linda wanted her frustrating efforts to get answers and action from Health Canada made public, but drew the line with the very personal physical medical information being shared on national television. I've assisted several other whistleblowers in Health Canada who fought their superiors against accepting the harmful use of growth hormones in beef production. Shiv Chopra, Margaret Hayden, and the late Jerry Lampert, 3 veterinarian scientists, tried many recourses to get their concerns inside Health Canada heard, but had to go outside and paid a steep price for that. Records obtained showed the inside trials they endured. A really different story was my access to information help for Meher Arar and Manya Mazet. Much as is or became known about the U.S. rendition and Syrian detention of Meher Arar. That work took 5 years and began with Manya while Meher was still in a Syrian jail. It was intense, emotionally draining at times, and complicated. But I did get significant data using that helped get the inquiry, the O'Connor inquiry underway, and for them and their team. To name a few significant finds obtained, him being beaten in Syrian jail in writing form, him being on the border watch list before being rendered to Syria, and how his suitcase, he just had a knapsack when he was rendered, came home from Tunisia, but he did not. The data showed Canadian authorities exchanged information or misinformation on Arar, including their meeting with Syrian intelligence. Arar's rendition documents confirmed was done with the knowledge of Canadian law and intelligence agencies. It also meant honoring Meher and Manya's request that certain foreign affairs records I had obtained on their behalf not be shared like their passport data, and some communications under duress that claim to assess Maher's state of mind and alleged motivations. It meant seeking files from over a dozen federal agencies and others, provincial, and mounting multi-appeals to get some further information. The O'Connor Inquiry report concluded there was no evidence to link R to terrorist activity, and they had to issue apologies, RCMP2, and give them $10.5 million, and more recently, the Canadian government for 3 other men who underwent Syrian torture have received similar compensation after much delay and official inquiries. Totally different case saw archaeologist Pat Sutherland fired from the Canadian Museum of Civilization, now the Museum of History. She and her husband, Robert McGee, wanted Ms. Sutherland's original Arctic research on her groundbreaking discovery of evidence that the Vikings could have possibly been in Central Arctic returned to her, and their names cleared, and Pat's job back. That did not happen. And now the museum wants to turn her work that they consider government property over to some American researchers, and I'm looking at that. Sometimes, though, some people who are just so dismissed or go through government grind don't want you to apply. That was the case of Tony Turner, the guy who made Harper Man quite famous and certainly helped to get rid of Mr. Harper. He was an Environment Canada wildlife researcher administrator. And as he said to me, because I drafted a request for him, well, I won't use the word rock the boat. I like my colleagues. I don't really want to do this. Yeah, it would be good to know who put the finger on me way up the line. But he's enjoying a musical career on the West Coast and quite happy with that. But he's also still grieving through his union, his unfair discipline, in effect dismissal, even though he was about to retire. A gutsy woman who happens to be with us today, Dr. Nancy Olivier, has spent 3 decades fighting for the right to do her hemoglobin research affecting seriously ill liver patients. She was concerned about the potential side effect an experimental drug, Ferroprox, made by Apotex, was having in not properly authorized research being done at the University Health Network here in Toronto. Ferroprox was licensed in 2015, but getting down on the drug's approval and adverse drug reaction history and health effects is one of my ongoing fights. No smiling there, Nancy. Lastly, I'm filing requests for Hassan Diab on the evidence surrounding his extradition to Paris based on questionable handwriting and other evidence alleging as a suspect for a 1980 bombing of a Paris synagogue attack. Mr. Diab gave his consent for me to obtain records from a Paris jail, where he's been for over 3 years. Now, turning to Indigenous matters briefly, I've worked with many groups, including the Cree in northern Quebec, seeking records on mining company pollution of their lands and waters. And on individual cases, like the northern Manitoban native, young disabled adult in a remote native community who has had to and still has to crawl around given inadequate in-home and disability services, including to an outhouse in the freezing weather that's their only means of toilet. Uncovered over 20 years ago were records that acknowledged despicable drinking water conditions on many reserves. And I've done time and time again, uncovered more and more, including details of the chemicals in each of these sites. And hard to get some of the Indigenous groups to use them. And yet we're still doing, in many reserves, boil water orders. Along the way, too, I dug up in external affairs records that Canada was the only country to vote against the UN resolution making access to clean drinking water an international right. There continues to be a constant challenges in Indigenous groups getting access to needed data, such as I am once again finding in my current attempt to get documents on conflicting Algonquin people's demands in Eastern Ontario, and that's a tough battle and an expensive one so far. Now, let's go to home base, universities and colleges. Hey, let's not leave them out. Ottawa's Algonquin College is one case in point. Getting information on departing previous President Robert Gillett, receiving a whopping $1.933 million in supplementary pension benefits on top of his annual $443,727 salary that came out of the college's operating funds was a shock to many at that college. It upset them, I guess. And this is the group who's just, coming off forced coming off a strike, where one of the issues, of course, is better pay for part-time researchers. Universities seem to take pleasure in being very protective of their records, hiring lawyers and setting up subsidiaries so they can avoid releasing data. Getting records, for instance, concerning the University of Lethbridge's controversial conspiratorial advocate and teacher Tony Hall's suspension and banishment from campus has been quite the battle. But in the last week or two, his suspension has been lifted because of the labor legislation that the Alberta NDP government introduced. He's not off the hook, but he's back there, and some of the documents I got revealed the most absurd arguments put forward by the university that totally ignored due process. Just get rid of him. So let's look at corporate, briefly, government ties. Ontario Finance and its rate regulator fought to keep Insurance Bureau of Canada records secret, claiming they were policy advice and cabinet confidences. Those records, after a successful appeal, revealed that IBC insisted government officials keep it informed about the development and regulations and legislation, for which, conveniently, they wrote most of. Ontario's system of auto insurance regulation is based on a secretive, too close, and one-sided industry-government relationship, keeps the Ontario public in the dark and auto insurance premiums rates high, with shrinking coverage and lesser and lesser benefits. Another example is Infrastructure Canada records that expose a very cozy government relationship in the setting up of this current Canada Information Bank, Infrastructure Bank. One record showed that BlackRock, the world's leading investor group, helped plan with the Canadian government on November 14th of 2016 here in Toronto, hustle towards getting this these people on side for this investor bank and really controlled the agenda of a Canadian government initiative. The records also raised the thing that there was a 14-member advisory council economic growth to the Minister of Finance. We all know about him. And BlackRock was on that one and so on. And so was Sabium, who happened to be pressing for infrastructure in Montreal at the same time, the light rail there. Another uncovered record was a KPMG study that said, go slow, go cautious, look at Australia and other companies. Problem was, I only got it the week before the legislation was going, the $74,000 study. And so it was pretty hard to make much use of it. The Globe did one or two stories. But the Trudeau government just rammed through the infrastructure bill. And in its provisions, it has permanent, no independent review, secrecy provisions. So if you want to find out domestic and financial transactions, potential conflict of interest situations, undue political interference, not there. One other area is, which of concern, is how we're targeted and tracked and our rights are abused. So one piece of this mass surveillance policy, because secrecy is paramount in it, is law enforcement's intelligence agency sought, was how did they get their spy equipment to spy on us? The documents sort of, went around it, but said they have to have license issued by the Federal Public Safety Administrator under the Criminal Code exception granted to the RCMP, CSIS, CSE, and provincial and municipal law enforcement agencies. So, for instance, in 2008-2016 period, over 100 such 1- and 2-year licenses with their details blanked out were granted. They did reveal, although the names of the companies weren't thing, and I suspect it was like the IMS cell phone intercept equipment Stingray, that CISAs, in granting it, were granted license retroactively and showed on the form they had a great trusted relationship with those supplying the spy equipment. So such an uncovered surveillance enabling system has very little public scrutiny and lacks adequate accountability built into its use. So I can only tell you in one relief form that I'm getting there, that there's a little humor in government. So in one case, Sheila Cox was Canadian Heritage Minister, and Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones were supposed to come to the Toronto Walk of Fame. Well, so a briefing note with a stilted transcript was issued, but Mick and the Rolling Stones never showed. But her imaginary conversation with Mick I got. Another one is what used to be called Skydome, where after embarrassing situation where a couple kept their curtains open during a baseball game, and everybody saw their form of intercourse. Then I figured, well, tongue-in-cheek, I should apply. I got to apply. So I got this Skydome form that Skydome hotel people had to fill out that they had to sign to keep their blinds closed should they feel the urge to, quote the form, be in a state of partial or complete undress. Talk about covering your rear end. But there's nothing funny. The story doesn't end there because at the time I was looking at Skydome's blocking my attempt to get data on their sweetheart deals with corporations like Coca-Cola and McDonald's, who they had signed up for exclusive 99-year marketing rights basis, complete with perks including their own boxes and so on. So things were getting tense, and when I started to get the full details of this, some guy let me in and start to look at them. The president of Skydome came by and literally kicked me out on the street. So all these great reports I never got. And guess what? The Toronto press were mainly in the pocket of, they were boosters of Skydome. Now Skydome, of course, has ended up as a place where a large public debt was incurred. It's been privatized, and of course it's beyond the reach of FOI. So I'm going to conclude by talking about the sad state of access to information, which doesn't meet up with any standards. Now, as I hinted at, the Trudeau government's dropped out on their promise to cover ministerial records as promised, and they sort of said, well, we'll give the order-making powers to the commissioner, but we'll start cutting these out so she doesn't really have much authority on this. The courts will intervene, this and that. Security matters, no, she can't do that, this and that. And then they said, oh, we've got this wonderful idea of periodic publication of government-selected summaries without any rights for the public to apply or really repeal them. And it's just like, this is what you're offering us for improving it? Yet at the same time, as I mentioned, you've already cut out the Canadian Information Bank and others. So I've been trying to fight along with many groups and Centre here for the regressive nature of this. We are hindered in this country by lengthy delays, high fees, creative avoidance, multi-exemptions and exclusions, some of the things I mentioned, and we just don't seem to get it. This must end. We need to dramatically change such non-empowering relationships. And all of this in an internet age with as many as 120 countries now possessing right-to-know legislation. One solution, I'll just get into this briefly, to this delay, deny, spin cycle is to pass the Second Generation Act. To make disclosure a constitutional right where government practice would include proactive record, service, open meeting management, and agency disclosure agreements. Proactive disclosure would mean health, safety, environment, and consumer records that affect our daily lives would be released by law right away. And the number of restrictions would drop dramatically. No more policy advice, for instance. This can be done with the creation of proactive codes and transparency agreements. So we'd be getting things like the Saudi Arabia human rights reports automatically, Prime Minister's daily agendas, Bombardier funding, clinical drug trial results, everything routinely released right away. And so, my friends, in conclusion, getting information reported and using it remains a constant battle. To dig for information needs, which all of you can do, curiosity, courage, and commitment, a bit of analytical skills and knowledge about institutional ways. Calling out injustice and exposing roadblocks is a must in the information battle. The information disclosed can hurt you. And that's quite true. But I'm not alone, and your actions and ours, we can seek a better solution for transparency. And I hope that this has sparked your interest. I mean, yeah, it's 5 decades, but what the hell, everybody can do it. And I'd like to thank the Center for giving me the opportunity to speak, and we'll gladly take questions and have you join the discussion. And I think nobody's left the room. That's hopefully a good sign.
Thank you, Ken. One of the problems if you're discussing some of the successes, albeit after prodigious work, is people can get the impression that the system may actually be functional. It just needs to be greased and oiled and pushed a little bit. I'm sure you could have given a much longer talk on all the things you've tried to get that you couldn't get. And in a sense, for many of the people in this room, I'm sure that's one of the interests. That is, I assume people who've come to this have either had experience in trying to get access to information or recognize the importance of getting access to information. So I was going to start off the questioning by asking you a question, if you could share with people. What guidance would you give to people who are just starting to use or have been using, but not to the degree you have, in doing the best you can under our badly flawed system? What advice would you give them as to what some things they could do to maximize their possibility of having success?
Well, first of all, you got to be persistent. You know, this is not a game for the weak-minded. Then you really have to be focused. And if you need help, you can even sometimes get help from the government people before you formally apply. You have to know a little bit about the government and which department to apply for, where to put your application in. And you just have to be prepared. You know, if you're a journalist, don't expect a story the next day, like in 3 months maybe, or a year. You really have to drill down, and you have to have the skill at negotiating, a little sense of humor, and go for the jugular.
You once told me that when you're seeking the information, you're dealing with various departmental or agency access to information coordinators, and that they vary a lot in terms of how they respond. Some see their job as keeping the activities of their department or agency invisible to the public, and others take their jobs seriously and try to facilitate you getting access to information. Can you just comment so that people, when they're approaching these folks, try to take advantage of the latter and recognize ways of getting around the former?
Well, I'd say 95% of the access officers are not very helpful. But having said that, most of them are civil. You have to be firm. With the electronic filing of applications now, you may never even see anybody in the department. It's that bad. or your caseload is put off for a year or two. Developing a relationship is helpful. Making it, being firm that you know what you want, or even if you don't know what you know, you say, well, I'd like to talk to a program person too, because that gets you in the door and you can find out a bit more about the information. On the whole, it's a real struggle, and I mean, access officers are mainly gatekeepers. They used to be fee keepers, and that's coming back. They're exemption keepers. They just, how many blanks you fill in, it seems to be their quota. I don't place much faith in them. I just keep badgering and badgering. I mean, Ontario, for instance, even worse, because you have fees that you put in a simple application. Because they can charge fees, it's going to be a few hundred or if not more dollars, and then for sure you have to negotiate, because that's expensive. Municipally too, you can have problems. They come under the same legislation as the problems, and across the country there's different pieces of legislation with similar problems, for sure. So you don't live in Ottawa, for instance, so you have a long distance relationship, makes it harder. Just like if you don't live in Toronto, provincially it's harder. So don't expect an easy ride here. They don't want to give you an easy ride.
Okay, but just my last question for you before I turn to the audience. You mentioned negotiate. So you put in a request to the Ontario government. You're told it's going to cost $1,400. What can you do?
Well, I always say that's unreasonable. And I always say, you know me, I don't want to pay any money. Sometimes you can, but you have to have a public interest cause, and they don't usually listen to you for a waiver. But I would say, okay, break it down. Okay, who did you send this to? Usually it's sent to several branches. Give me the breakdown of fees per branch. Give me the breakdown. I have several items in what I'm asking. Give me the breakdown per item, because you might see where the volume is or where the charges are. Give me a breakdown of search as opposed to preparation, or let me talk to someone and let me negotiate with them as to, what I think I need. I don't want the kitchen sink. I want certain records. So, like with Indigenous Affairs in Ontario, they wanted 3,600 down to 1,400, which is still a lot. But believe you me, the Algonquin groups I'm working for will pay it. But I'm very uncomfortable paying fees for anybody. But you have to not accept outright the fees. And of course, federally, right now, you only have to pay $5 because the court decision threw out the fees. So take advantage while you can, because the fees are coming back. But fees are a burden. But delay is one of the real killers too.
Do you have any recourse when you start facing excessive delays?
Yes, I'm glad to say that in Ontario that the commission is effective, and to appeal for times, fees, exemptions is good. I'm less of a fan federally, even if the commission gets order-making powers. I find that they delay things for so long and they're not that effective, but that's me personally. I don't, you exert your rights for sure. And the information commissioner in Ontario also handles municipal or hospital, school boards appeals.
Okay, are there questions? Yes, Evan.
You mentioned that fees were coming back.
Oh, here's a microphone, just a second.
You mentioned that
No, it's
you mentioned that fees were coming back federally, because right now it's just $5 and you get your hopefully you get your documentation you're looking for. Why are they coming back?
Well, under this bill C-58, there's a clause in there that says fees will be permitted, the regulations will come. And I just know these guys well enough that they're pissed off that the fees went by the wayside. Not that they collect much money. I mean, it's cost recovery wise, but it's a barrier. It's a game. So I'm pretty sure that they'll bring back regulations, which will be computer, manual, you name it.
Any other questions? Yes, over here.
Have you ever approached CSIS or CSEC for anything?
thesis or
SEC.
CSE?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And were you successful?
Well,
Can you
it's
describe?
usually-
Can you describe one of the anecdotes?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I've gotten for people their files, with their consent, but usually what you get is newspaper clippings. They don't usually give you an indication if you've been under surveillance or not. I mean, on the policy level, like CSIS would give me their information data sharing agreement with the RCMP after, hassling and so on. CSC is even more secretive, but they do a lot of work with, protect your records as government federal agencies. So certain things, you're not under signal intelligence. There's certain things with, you can find out the description of what they do and, look for the maybe openings and go for them. But in the whole, and there's a clause in the current legislation that says neither confirm nor deny. So they don't even have to tell you what exemptions they apply. And for sure, they and other agencies don't, when they give you the records, they don't tell you page by page which exemption they've applied. Just say it in the covering letter. So it's a challenge, but CSIS in particular is used to people applying for security files. What they have, it's like Health Canada, and they'll give you a bit of drug information. There, they'll just give you the bare minimum.
But Canadians do have a right to ask for a copy of the records that the RCMP or CSIS have on them?
Yeah, and I mean, I would suggest when you're applying for records of that nature, make sure you apply under both the Access to Information and Privacy Act. Privacy Act, there's no fees, although, and some of the records are generally privacy records. Yes,
Okay.
sir.
Next.
So I'm a reporter at the Ryerson over here, and you were talking a little bit about universities being difficult when it comes to access to information, and that's certainly been my experience. But I'm wondering if you could speak about some common ways in which they prevent people from accessing information.
Yeah, well, one of them is, unfortunately, the Supreme Court in a Calgary case said that legal lawyers solicitor client stuff is verbatim, and it's had a ripple effect on everywhere in the country. But that's the fact of the matter is universities seem to have legal counsels or outside counsels, and they tend to just throw the stuff their way. So that is one device. Another device that I was hinting at is, if you've got deals with companies like Coca-Cola or whatever, you just flip that into a little foundation thing or, whatever, and that's just not covered. Another way is simply that academics are a bunch of bickering people at times, and so these are personal notes. Uh-oh, somebody's smiling. So it's really, this is all private, you can't get it. So, yeah, and even on student matters, you're not on the board of governors, you don't get the subtleties necessarily of the ins and outs of the financial figures or whatever you want. It's difficult. It's partly that universities, even more than colleges, are self-important. Like, why should we release records? A lot of them were covered not in the first run of access to information. So when they came in struggling, they didn't want anything of it. They still haven't got it through their little heads that what's ordinary is ordinary.
Gentleman back here.
Regarding secrecy of provincial government utility, OPG has a lot of deep secrets. The nuclear industry seems to be above the law, and it's very hard to get information about how much water they use out of Lake Ontario, what temperature they use for dumping it back into the lake, where the storage, how much storage capacity do they need, and it's additional every day. They in business they produce more nuclear waste, and it's very difficult to get straight answers from all these questions. Is there any timely way of getting that information, or are they above the law? You just give up?
Well, a few years ago, Ontario Hydro, before it was split, used to be covered, but then one reason they split it is part of the split meant that they weren't covered under the legislation.
You might just explain for people who don't know that history, Ontario Hydro is a Crown corporation, then it divided and privatized.
Yeah, a power corporate. So it's difficult to get that information.
Because the private part of it is not covered
Right.
by access to information
Right.
legislation.
But there's no harm in trying. Sometimes there's special reports. I haven't done that in a while, so I can't offer you the specifics of it. There are groups, environmental groups and others who would be more, perhaps Greenpeace, who would be more conversant in how to, or what kind of information they can get.
Private section, there is another nuclear reactor near on Lake Huron, which is privately owned, I understand. So that's a huge nuclear reactor. They're completely exempted from any scrutiny.
Well, there is still the federal, a great job nuclear, Canadian Nuclear Agency that you can get some reports from, and they do called BDM reports that you can get some information on specific reactors and so on. So that's one other way of getting around.
Also, more generally, if you're trying to get information on groups that aren't covered by access to information, sometimes you can get it through their interactions with groups that are covered.
Correct.
So if there's interaction between the federal government and or a provincial government and a private corporation or whatever, you may be able to get access to the information through the government's coverage. One last question. Nancy, did you have a? Okay.
You mentioned earlier about the public interest override in the legislation, which broadly says, if the information is in public interest, everything else can be stripped away, the exemptions and the protections. Have you ever had any success in unredacting information or going back and having them release additional information they had at first exempted using that public interest override?
Well, first of all, in effect, there's no public interest override in federal legislation other than for commercial information, and it's very weak. And I lost a significant case on calcium channel blockers where I was saying that the drug companies' rights didn't exceed the rights of the public interest override. It's very limited. Now, not totally the same in provincial legislation where the public interest override applies to more than just one, like commercial confidentiality. The problem is when you're making the appeals, it says overwhelmingly applies. So the burden of proof is fairly great. Yes, I think on, if I recall, on Ontario nuclear waste, I used it successfully, but it's few and far between. Now, in Britain and other places that have better legislation than us, and other groups have argued for a more flexible public interest override, there's some degree of success, but as I've often said, think about it, like, why are these legislation houses of principle exemptions? Narrow and restricted, they call it, which is bullshit. So the fact of the matter is, unless you limit the exemptions and exclusions, you're just, like the public interest override thing is like a token, we'll give them a bit more information. I'm not belittling it. I was taken to task by one or two other international groups who are really all in favor of it. But I'm saying, in my bill, or the way I do it, I would want proactive disclosure codes, so I don't have to bother with public interest override. There'd be fewer exemptions, and I would automatically get those health, safety, environment, and consumer reports, and that's that. I don't want the hassle of pleading my case every time, please,
But see, Ken, the problem is you view those data as belonging to the public.
It's a bit of a problem.
Right? And our legislation views the public as the problem that has to beg and plead or ask, and if it meets certain conditions and it's not otherwise exempted or excluded, it may be able to see these data that are kept by our public agencies. And that's what we're trying to change. So join me in thanking Ken for his presentation, and thank you for coming.
And if someone has some questions, by all means, I can stay
Yeah,
for a
please.
while.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much, everyone.